Scott Reed never expected that an ordinary evening in his home would turn into the most catastrophic event of his life. It was just past sunset, the sky painted in deep hues of orange and purple, and he was sitting in his living room with a book in hand, enjoying the rare tranquility that his neighborhood in Oak Ridge Estates provided. The Homeowners Association, notorious for its iron grip on the community, had at least succeeded in maintaining a peaceful environment, though it came at the cost of excessive regulations and absurdly strict rules. Scott had lived here for nearly a decade, and while he had never been a fan of the Homeowner Association's constant interference in his life, he had learned to pick his battles. After all, as long as he mowed his lawn to the exact height specifications and kept his trash cans hidden on non-collection days, he was mostly left alone. That night, however, was different. As Scott flipped a page of his book, a distant rumbling noise made him pause. At first, he dismissed it as just another commercial jet flying overhead. The neighborhood wasn't directly under a flight path, but occasionally planes from the nearby municipal airport would pass over. This time, though, the sound didn't fade. It grew louder, sharper, more urgent. The walls of his house trembled as the low rumble escalated into a deafening roar. Scott barely had time to process what was happening before a violent explosion of sound and impact shattered the calm. The world seemed to explode around him as the ceiling buckled and debris rained down from above. A wall of fire and metal came crashing through his living room, sending splinters of wood, shattered glass, and chunks of drywall flying in every direction. The force of the impact hurled Scott backward, his head slamming against the armrest of his couch as he fell. His vision blurred, his ears rang with an unbearable high-pitched whine, and for a few terrifying moments he wasn't sure if he was dead or alive. The smell of burning fuel was the first thing that hit him when he regained some sense of awareness. Smoke thickened the air, clawing at his throat and lungs, making every breath feel like swallowing fire. Coughing violently, Scott pushed himself up, his body aching from the impact. His entire house, or what was left of it, was a scene from a war zone. Flames licked the shattered remains of his walls, his furniture was crushed under mangled pieces of metal, and the once pristine hardwood floors were littered with wreckage. It took him a moment to realize what had happened. A plane had crashed into his house. Adrenaline surged through his veins as he stumbled to his feet, his mind screaming at him to get out. The fire was spreading fast, the heat already unbearable. The entire front of his house was gone, replaced by a massive gaping hole where the small aircraft had torn through. Scott didn't waste another second. He sprinted toward what remained of his back door, kicking debris out of his way as he went. He could hear sirens now, blaring in the distance, growing closer. Someone must have called 911. As soon as he made it outside, he collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. His heart hammered in his chest as he turned back to see the full extent of the devastation. Half his house was gone. What remained was crumbling, flames consuming everything in their path. Pieces of the plane's fuselage stuck out at odd angles, its wing lodged where his kitchen once stood. A part of the tail had broken off and now rested in what used to be his driveway. Neighbors had begun gathering, their faces pale with shock. Some had their phones out, recording, while others whispered among themselves. The flickering firelight illuminated their horrified expressions as they took in the wreckage. Scott barely noticed them. His entire world had been turned upside down in a matter of minutes. He clenched his fists, still trying to comprehend how this could have happened. Planes weren't supposed to just fall out of the sky, especially not onto people's homes. What were the odds of something like this? The fire department arrived within minutes, firefighters rushing in with hoses battling the flames. EMTs swarmed Scott, checking him for injuries. "Sir, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" one of them asked, shining a flashlight into his eyes. I think I'm fine," he rasped, though his entire body ached. The paramedics insisted on checking him over, but apart from a few cuts and bruises, he was miraculously unharmed. A police officer approached him next. "Sir, do you live here?" Scott nodded weakly. "We need to ask you a few questions, but first, You have somewhere else to stay tonight, somewhere else to stay. The reality of the situation hit him like a sledgehammer. His home was gone. Everything he owned, everything he had worked for, reduced to rubble. His clothes, his documents, his entire life, all destroyed in a freak accident. He stared at the wreckage, unable to process it. I don't know, he admitted. The officer nodded solemnly. We'll arrange temporary shelter for you. The Red Cross will be setting up emergency housing. Scott barely heard the rest of what was said. His mind was still reeling. He should have been relieved to be alive, but as he looked around at the flames still crackling, the jet fuel still burning, he knew that his nightmare was only just beginning. He had no idea just how much worse things were about to get. The smell of smoke still clung to Scott Reed's clothes as he sat in the temporary hotel room provided by the Red Cross. It had been 3 days since the plane had crashed into his house, reducing his life to rubble. The events played over and over in his head like a horror movie he couldn't turn off. The deafening roar, the explosion, the sheer terror of escaping the inferno. Now he was left with nothing but a handful of belongings, a headache that wouldn't go away, and an endless stream of paperwork from his insurance company. Despite everything, Scott tried to remain hopeful. The authorities had assured him that the pilot, who had been the only one aboard the aircraft, hadn't survived the crash, and while the investigation was ongoing, the general consensus was that it had been due to mechanical failure. His insurance company had also confirmed that they would cover the damages, at least in theory. Bureaucracy moved at a snail's pace, and in the meantime, Scott was in limbo. He had barely begun wrapping his head around what rebuilding his home would entail when he received the letter. It was a crisp, cream-colored envelope with the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association logo stamped in bold lettering at the top. Scott recognized it instantly, and his stomach twisted into a knot before he even opened it. He had dealt with the homeowner association before, though only for minor issues. An unauthorized holiday decoration once, a warning about his trash cans being visible from the street. Absurd little power plays that he had mostly ignored. This, however, was different. With a sinking feeling, he unfolded the letter and began to read. Dear Mr. Reed, it has come to the attention of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association that your property at 1417 Maple Crest Lane has been left in a state of severe disrepair, negatively impacting the aesthetic integrity of our community. As you are aware, Oak Ridge Estates maintains strict guidelines to uphold neighborhood standards and protect property values. Your property, in its current state, does not meet these guidelines and is in clear violation of multiple homeowner association regulations. To rectify this issue, you are required to submit reconstruction plans for your home within the next 14 days. These plans must adhere to the Oak Ridge Estates architectural standards and be approved by the Homeowner Association Board before any construction may begin. Any deviations from the original structure will be subject to fines. Additionally, we are issuing a preliminary penalty of $5,000 for failure to maintain your property in a condition befitting our community. Further fines will accrue at a rate of $200 per day until compliance is met. Failure to address these violations may result in legal action. Please submit your plans and initial payment promptly to avoid further penalties. Sincerely, Ronald Cartwright, President, Oak Ridge Estates Homeowner Association. Scott stared at the letter, his brain refusing to process the words. His property was in a state of disrepair? They were treating this like he had neglected his lawn or left his garbage cans out, and not like a goddamn plane had crashed through his house. For a long moment, he simply sat there, gripping the letter so tightly that the paper began to crumple in his fists. This had to be a mistake, a cruel joke. Maybe some automated system had flagged his house as being abandoned and no one had actually looked into what happened. Maybe if he called, they would apologize and rescind the fine. Deep down, though, he knew better. With a heavy sigh, he picked up his phone and dialed the Homeowner Association's number. The line rang a few times before a chirpy, overly polite voice answered. Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, this is Sharon speaking. How can I help you today? Scott gritted his teeth. Yeah, hi. This is Scott Reed. I just got a letter from you guys about my house, the one that had a plane crash into it. There was a pause. Let me pull up your file, Mr. Reed. He could hear the sound of typing on a keyboard. Then, after a few seconds, she spoke again. Ah, yes, I see the violation notice here. Are you calling to submit your payment, or do you need assistance with the reconstruction guidelines? Scott blinked. Am I... what? No, I'm calling because this is ridiculous. My house was destroyed by an airplane. What exactly do you expect me to do? Well, Mr. Reed, she replied in a tone that suggested she was reading off a script. Oak Ridge Estates has strict community standards, and all properties must be maintained in accordance with homeowner association regulations. If you require assistance in finding a contractor who meets our specifications, we can provide recommendations. Are you listening to me? Scott said, his voice rising. My house didn't burn down because I left a candle unattended. A plane crashed into it. I don't even have a place to live right now. And you're telling me I owe $5,000 because my lot doesn't look pretty? Sir, I understand this must be a frustrating time for you, but the rules apply to all residents equally, Sharon said, her tone still infuriatingly chipper. You'll need to submit your reconstruction plans within the next 14 days to avoid further penalties. Scott felt like his blood pressure was skyrocketing. He had been dealing with insurance headaches, struggling to figure out how to put his life back together, and now this? You know what, he said finally. I need to speak to someone in charge. Get me the homeowner association president. Mr. Cartwright is unavailable at the moment, she replied smoothly, but I'd be happy to schedule an appointment for you. Yeah, Scott snapped. Do that. As he hung up, he could feel his hands shaking from sheer frustration. He had heard horror stories about homeowner associations, but this was beyond anything he could have imagined. It wasn't just incompetence. It was willful extortion. And for the first time since the crash, Scott wasn't just exhausted or overwhelmed. He was angry, and he was going to fight back. Scott Reed had never been one for conflict, but as he sat in the cramped hotel room, gripping the homeowner association's letter in his hands, he felt a surge of rage, unlike anything he had ever experienced. The sheer audacity of it was almost laughable. Almost. They had fined him for not maintaining his property, a property that no longer existed, a property that had been reduced to smoldering rubble because of something entirely out of his control, and now they were demanding thousands of dollars in penalties, as if the crash had been some minor inconvenience like a patch of overgrown grass or a missing mailbox. He barely slept that night. His mind kept running through every possible scenario, trying to find some logic in the homeowner association's actions. Was it incompetence, a clerical error, or was this exactly what it looked like? A calculated move to exploit him when he was at his weakest. The next morning, with dark circles under his eyes and a gnawing headache from lack of sleep, he called his lawyer, Donald Clark. Donald didn't even try to mask his disbelief when Scott explained the situation. "You're telling me they fined you for a plane crash?" he asked, his voice laced with incredulity. "I've seen some insane homeowner association cases, but this? This is a new level of stupid." Scott wasn't in the mood for jokes. "Can they do this?" he asked. "Legally, I mean." Donald let out a slow exhale, rubbing his temples. "Homeowner associations operate under their own bylaws, which homeowners agree to when they move in, but those rules aren't above state or federal law. Fining you for something beyond your control, especially something this extreme, is legally questionable at best and outright harassment at worst." He paused. "We can fight this. First, we'll send them a formal dispute letter, demanding they rescind the fines. If they don't back down, we take this to the state housing board, maybe even the media. Trust me, once people hear about a guy losing his home to a plane crash and then getting harassed for it, public outrage alone might be enough to make them fold. Scott felt a flicker of hope, but it was buried under layers of exhaustion and anger. He gave Donald the green light to draft the letter, and within an hour it was sent to the homeowner association. Now, all he had to do was wait. 2 days later, the response came, and it was worse than he had expected. The homeowner association had not only refused to drop the fines, but they had doubled down. The letter was filled with bureaucratic nonsense, but the core message was clear. The destruction of his home had negatively impacted the aesthetic integrity of the community, and unless he submitted reconstruction plans within 2 weeks, he would continue accruing daily fines. Scott couldn't believe what he was reading. They were treating this like he had chosen to let his house rot, instead of acknowledging that a goddamn airplane had destroyed it. He didn't care about their community standards. His home had been obliterated, and instead of offering support, they were trying to squeeze money out of him. It was beyond infuriating. He stormed into Donald's office, practically throwing the letter onto the desk. "They're not backing down," he said through gritted teeth. "They don't care about the law. They just want money." Donald read the letter, his expression shifting from disbelief to something colder, more calculating. "They just made a huge mistake," he muttered. Scott frowned. "What do you mean?" "They just admitted in writing that their main concern is property values, not community welfare. That means they're enforcing rules for financial gain, not actual safety or upkeep. That's legally shady as hell." He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers against the desk. "All right, Plan B," Scott crossed his arms. "Which is? We go public." That night, Donald helped Scott send the story to every major news outlet in the city. It didn't take long for it to explode. The headline spread like wildfire. "Plane crash survivor fined by homeowner association for losing his home." Thousands of people flooded the homeowner association's Facebook page with outrage, calling them heartless, corrupt, and demanding answers. Local news stations picked up the story, and soon reporters were showing up at the remains of Scott's property, broadcasting live from the wreckage. The homeowner association, which had been so quick to demand fines, suddenly found itself under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Scott watched it all unfold with a grim sense of satisfaction. They had wanted to intimidate him into compliance. Instead, they had walked straight into a PR nightmare. Scott had never imagined that one day he would become the face of a public scandal. But as he watched his story spread like wildfire across the news and social media, he realized that this was no longer just about him. The homeowner association had made a fatal mistake by doubling down instead of backing off. And now, the entire country was watching. News outlets ran with the absurdity of the situation. Plane crash victim fined for losing his home. Homeowner association from hell harasses man after tragedy. And when a plane destroys your house and homeowner association destroys your life. Within hours, homeowner association representatives found themselves swamped with interview requests, but none of them wanted to speak. Their silence only made things worse. The local news station had sent a reporter, a sharp and relentless woman named Lisa Hartman, to cover the story. She had been the first to arrive at the wreckage, standing in front of the charred remains of Scott's house as the camera rolled. "Behind me," she said, "is all that's left of what was once a home. Scott Reed, the man who lived here, lost everything when a private aircraft crashed directly into his house. But instead of support, the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association decided to fine him thousands of dollars for failing to maintain community standards." She turned to Scott, who stood beside her, arms crossed, jaw clenched. "Mr. Reed, what do you have to say to the Homeowner Association's response?" Scott took a deep breath, knowing that whatever he said now would be broadcast across the city, maybe even the country. "I think it's disgusting," he said bluntly. "I lost my home in an accident I had no control over. Instead of offering help, the Homeowner Association is trying to bleed me dry. They don't care about the people who live in this neighborhood, only about their own power. If this is what they call community, then it's a joke." The response was immediate. By the end of the day, homeowner association board members were receiving hundreds of angry calls and emails from people demanding they drop the fines. But instead of admitting fault, the homeowner association president, Ronald Cartwright, finally issued a statement. Scott read it with growing disbelief. Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association has always upheld the highest standards for our community. While we sympathize with Mr. Reed's unfortunate situation, we must enforce the rules consistently to preserve the integrity of our neighborhood. We cannot make exceptions that would set a precedent for future violations. Scott nearly threw his phone across the room. Future violations? He growled to Donald, who sat across from him in the hotel lobby, sipping his coffee. They're acting like I left my house to rot on purpose. A plane fell out of the sky, Donald. I don't understand how they can possibly justify this. Donald chuckled darkly. They're playing damage control, but they're doing it badly. That statement reads like it was written by a lawyer trying to avoid a lawsuit while still keeping their cash grab intact. But guess what? We're not backing down. The legal battle began in earnest. Donald filed an official complaint with the State Housing Board, citing harassment and unlawful fines. Meanwhile, Scott took his fight directly to the community. He posted flyers around the neighborhood, warning other homeowners that the homeowner association was prioritizing property values over actual human lives. He knocked on doors, spoke to neighbors, and gathered signatures for a petition demanding the immediate removal of the fines. What surprised him most was how many people were willing to speak out. Turns out, he wasn't the only one who'd been screwed over by the homeowner association. I got fined last year because my Christmas lights were up a day past the deadline, an older man named Greg told him. They sent me a notice saying I was violating seasonal decoration policies. I thought it was insane, but I paid because I didn't want trouble. They tried to fine me for parking in my own driveway, said a young woman named Hannah. Apparently, I had to park in my garage or face a neighborhood obstruction fee. I had just had a baby and needed easy access to my car. But they didn't care. Scott listened to story after story, each more absurd than the last. It wasn't just him. The homeowner association had been using ridiculous rules to squeeze money out of people for years, and no one had ever fought back. Until now. The pressure on the homeowner association intensified. More news stations picked up the story. A local radio host did an entire segment on the worst homeowner associations in America, featuring Oak Ridge Estates as a prime example. Online, people flooded review sites and forums with negative comments exposing years of corrupt practices. Scott was contacted by a lawyer who specialized in suing homeowner associations, offering to represent him pro bono just to take them down. Then, the lawsuits started rolling in. Homeowners who had been bullied for years saw Scott as their rallying point. A group of them filed a class action lawsuit against the homeowner association for predatory fines and financial misconduct. The state attorney general's office opened an investigation into the homeowner association's financial records, suspecting mismanagement and fraud. One night, just as Scott was about to go to sleep, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Hello," he answered. There was a pause, then a gruff voice on the other end. "Mr. Reed, this is Ronald Cartwright." Scott sat up, instantly alert. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Another pause, then, with obvious reluctance, Cartwright said, "The board has decided to reconsider your case. If you agree to withdraw your media involvement, we will waive your fines." Scott let the silence stretch. Then he laughed. "Oh, now you want to negotiate, after you tried to bleed me dry? After you told the world I was a violation of community standards? You made this personal," Cartwright said sharply. "You turned people against us." "No, Ronald," Scott said. "You did that. I just made sure everyone saw it." There was another long silence before Cartwright's voice hardened. "You can take the deal, or we can keep this going. But I promise you, Mr. Reed, we have more resources than you do." Scott smirked. "Then let's see how much money your precious homeowner association has left when we're done dragging you through the courts." The next morning, he called Donald. "They're getting desperate," he said. Cartwright offered to drop the fines if I shut up. Donald laughed. That means we're winning, but we're not done yet. Scott knew he was right. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been bullied by an homeowner association that thought it was untouchable. And he wasn't going to stop until they were taken down for good. Scott had always heard that power-hungry homeowner association boards never backed down easily, but he had underestimated just how far they were willing to go. After his conversation with Ronald Cartwright, the president of the homeowner association, he knew one thing for certain. The board was desperate. They were trying to cut their losses, hoping that a quiet settlement would make everything disappear. But Scott had no intention of backing down. He had come too far, and now it wasn't just about his house. It was about standing up to the kind of bureaucratic tyranny that had made countless homeowners feel powerless. The very next morning, Scott and Donald drafted their next move. They weren't just going to refuse the settlement offer, they were going to escalate. Donald filed an official civil suit against the homeowner association for fraudulent fines, harassment, and emotional distress, citing their reckless disregard for the circumstances of the plane crash. But the real blow came when the state attorney general's office launched a formal investigation into the homeowner association's financial practices. It turned out that Scott's case had drawn the attention of government watchdogs who had begun looking into the homeowner association's past violations. What they found was shocking. Over $1,200,000 in unexplained administrative fees taken from homeowners over the last 5 years, countless shady fines, and multiple instances of funds being misappropriated by board members. In short, the homeowner association had been scamming the community for years, and Scott's battle had simply exposed their corruption to the world. Scott, however, was still in the thick of it. The media firestorm continued, and the pressure on the homeowner association reached a breaking point. Every day, new headlines emerged. Homeowner association under investigation for financial fraud, Oak Ridge Estates president accused of embezzlement, and homeowners demand resignation of entire homeowner association board. Scott watched with satisfaction as public outrage turned into real consequences. The community, once afraid to speak up, now openly protested the homeowner association, demanding their resignation. Then the unthinkable happened. Ronald Cartwright resigned. The official statement cited personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth. He had been forced out before he could drag the homeowner association down any further. It didn't stop there. 2 other board members also stepped down, likely trying to escape the legal storm heading their way. The homeowner association had gone from untouchable overlords to a collapsing house of cards. For Scott, though, the fight wasn't over. He still had to rebuild his home. The fines were officially dropped, but the damage had been done. His insurance company was still tangled in paperwork, and every step forward felt like a battle. But this time he wasn't alone. Neighbors who had once been strangers now stopped him in the street to thank him. Some offered to help with legal fees. Others simply wanted to shake his hand and tell him that he had done what they had always been too afraid to do: stand up to the homeowner association and win. Months passed, and slowly things began to settle. The homeowner association, now under new leadership, had been stripped of much of its power. The aggressive fines, the absurd rules, gone. Scott worked tirelessly to rebuild his home, this time on his terms. No more ridiculous aesthetic regulations, no more homeowner association interference. It took nearly a year, but when he finally moved back in, it wasn't just about reclaiming his house. It was about reclaiming his life. On the day of his return, his new neighbors, many of whom had been victims of the homeowner association's corruption, threw him a celebration barbecue. They laughed, drank, and shared stories of their own run-ins with the old board. Scott, for the first time in a long while, felt at peace. As the sun set over the newly rebuilt home, he stood on his porch, looking out at the community that had once been ruled by fear. Now there was a sense of freedom, of relief. The homeowner association had tried to destroy him, but in the end they had destroyed themselves. Scott had won. And he had made sure that no one in Oak Ridge Estates would ever be bullied by an homeowner association again.